Oh, well, good morning. Thank you for
Thank you.
joining us at the AppCon 2.0. Today's Lunch and Learn session, I'm absolutely delighted to share with you that we have Dr. Safiya Umoja Noble, who is an Internet Studies and Digital Media Scholar. She's also actually Associate Professor of Gender Studies and African American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Welcome, Dr. Noble.
Thank
It is
you. Thank you
indeed
so
a
much.
pleasure to have you here with us today. And I know that you've got so many accolades, but I think the first thing is probably to have you in your own words. If you would just tell us a little bit about yourself that we don't already know from our internet searches and your website, which is quite informative, and of course, the whole host of writings and scholarly work that you have.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for this invitation, Claire. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here with you and your team today. Let's see where to start. I mean, I think it's important. One of the things that a lot of people don't ever get to hear about is a little bit of the origin story, kind of pre-professional, which I think might be helpful to people who are listening and participating, because I think one thinks that someone becomes a scholar or a professor, like that you knew when you were 6 years old and you got on a path and you followed that trajectory. And of course, I had nothing but a circuitous route to this moment. I grew up in a place called Fresno, California, which is a not so small town between LA and the Bay Area in California, but it's a place that, like many people of color grow up in, was a harsh place, a place that didn't always you couldn't always catch a break, let's say, in. And I went to my local university. I went to Fresno State as an undergrad, and my sister went to community college, and we kind of took a long road toward something like getting a PhD in my case, which I didn't do till much later in life. And I did all the kinds of work that many people do. I was a bartender. I worked in restaurants. I worked in retail. I sold clothes. I worked on my college campus and work study and those kinds of things. And, those things are really important, I think, as part of the story about my work, because back then, in the 80s and the 90s, right, when you were looking for work, a lot of that came through personal networks of people you met, friends of friends of friends who helped open doors for you. People took different kinds of chances on us, kind of reputationally. And now, fast forward, here I am. I'm a professor of the internet. I kind of study the internet. My PhD is in information science. And I see how much the world has changed with respect to how we live and work and play. And so much of that is mediated by the internet. So, in essence, what I do is I study kind of the harsh dimensions, the dark side of the internet, the harmful ways in which large scale digital media platforms that we all use every day, platforms like Google, Facebook, software companies that you may have never heard of, but companies that do things like make predictive analytics and
Right.
algorithms that determine whether you match the profile for a job or whether you don't. Um, I look at all the ways in which technology is really mediating our lives, and the unintended consequences, and even the racial and gender discrimination that happens in these technologies. And so I'm really excited to be in this conversation with you today, Claire, because I feel like the the way in which employers are often thinking about finding work and talent is often by using software, using different kinds of matching algorithms, relying upon databases of people to help them. And I think we should unpack a little bit of what's happening in those systems for employers, because they are, really not always that reliable. these
Sure.
systems. But I also think we need to talk about it for people looking for jobs so that we can understand, that there's a lot of gaming that goes on in these systems just to even make yourself visible or known or to kind of break through. And there's also a lot of discrimination that is built into a lot of these systems. And so those are the things I study in my center at UCLA. And I think that those kinds of things are really relevant for a conference like this today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so I have a hyphenated name and my adoptive maiden name is Razak. So right off the bat, I was discriminated against just based on the name. Sight unseen, of course, I went to school in the 80s as well. And so potential employers, there was no internet then. And so they literally just went off the names and any other intuitive things that they could decipher from my resume or other credentials. So
That's right.
I can just imagine if I was, 20 years younger and what I would be going through on the internet. So I think your work is absolutely essential and a genuine service to the public.
Thank you.
So have you always been interested in public service or even activism on behalf of those that are underrepresented and unprotected in our society?
Well, I don't know if I would say always, but certainly once I came of age and went to college, I mean, I understood my parents as people who were active in different ways around kind of the civil rights and Black Power movements when they were younger people. And I grew up Gen X, so I grew up in, integrated schools that were very multicultural. California, obviously, being a very kind of multicultural place. My high school, I think there were over 90 different languages spoken by people in my high school because people came from all over the world. We had huge kind of relocation of Southeast Asians into the San Joaquin Valley. And so there was just a lot of different kinds of people that I was always exposed to. And when I went to college, I think at Fresno State is probably where I became politically educated and became politically aware of so many things. And part of that had to do with the war in Central America was happening when I was an undergrad. And I had a teacher who had spent his summers there working working against the war. Rodney King was beaten in LA by LAPD. And of course, that really shaped so many of us. And so we were working and kind of sitting in and protesting around divestment, getting our campus to divest from South Africa and, end apartheid. So those were kind of like that was in the zeitgeist when I was a young person. And I just was aware and paying attention to it. And I got active on my campus around many of these issues and many kind of more local issues around racism and discrimination and sexism as a student. So I was like most people, just responding to the times. And I think people who are empathic in the world are often speaking back to power and injustice just because that seems like the right thing to do. But that's a little bit different maybe than kind of thinking of myself as an activist, although I certainly was. It wasn't like an identity I sought to cultivate. I just, I just wanted to be a person who was responding, and fortunately, so did most of my friends. And so we were out in the streets. We still are out in the streets, I guess, in many ways.
Say, very good. So you describe some of those events that impacted you while you were in university, and that then engendered that political awareness that obviously is still with you today. So then through that journey, though, so that was pre-internet, pre-digital media. So can you point to a catalyst since that point that created your awareness about what was going on in the world of the internet and digital media as a whole, and how it impacts the underrepresented and unprotected demographics that you speak to?
Well, certainly, when I was an undergrad was when the internet really became something that students were using. Now, this is kind of pre-graphic user interface. So this is when
Yeah.
it was just text on a screen. And in particular, I remember my friends and I talking on the internet, and by talking, I mean typing words on a screen to students in South Africa, and trying to understand kind of what was happening there in the anti-apartheid movement. And these were like some of my white friends who were like, politically radical, who were also nerds. And, I remember they would always like kind of try to get me engaged. And I had email and things like this, like in the late 80s or early 90s. And I just remember thinking like, oh, why would anyone want to ever sit in front of a computer all day? Like that's
Right.
like so boring. And yet those early touch points of the internet were around kind of creating networks of response and resistance to things that were happening. And so there also were people on the internet, like I was really aware, like Nazis and white supremacists and this kinds of thing, because I had so many friends who were like in these early internet chat rooms, and were coming into contact with hateful people. And I also was repelled by that. I just didn't even want to be exposed to it. Fast forward, I found myself working in a career in corporate America, where I was doing things like helping open up community technology centers in, East Oakland and West Oakland and, East Palo Alto and places like this. And I certainly saw that the lack of access to computers was becoming an important thing to pay attention to, because so many government services were starting to move online. People were being forced to use the internet to access basic services by different kinds of states and federal government programs. And lots of people who needed them did not have computers. So I was definitely working on those issues in the 90s and the early 2000s. And then I think when it really started to crystallize was when I went back to graduate school, and I saw so many people talking about Google and the internet, and social media was just starting to become a thing. I mean, in the way like we think about Facebook or Twitter, MySpace and other kinds of social media sites were online, but there was definitely a lot of organized hate even back then. I mean, we think of it as like being maybe a newer phenomena that led to the January 6th kind of, sedition. But honestly, the racism of the internet has been with us the whole time that we've been on the internet. And it's just become so much more acute. One of the things that I saw was that people were relating to Google and these platforms like they were the next, like they were the only way, and they were reliable, and they were the liberatory possibility, and you could access all the world's knowledge. These are like Google's mantras, they're kind of mottos. And yet the truth was, I knew these were like advertising platforms. I knew these were highly manipulated, and I wanted to write and talk about the degree to which we are manipulated when we use them, and the way in which we're distorted also, and how they represent us.
Goodness. Yeah, I mean, you described the onset or beginning of the awareness of the internet, or what we called the World Wide Web. So where I worked, and we had one computer actually that could access the World Wide Web. And even at the time, we were aware of these other chat rooms, if you will, behind the scenes. And you're right, it was very repelling. But where most people run away from that, obviously you must have dove headlong to study this and understand it a bit more, so that you could educate us on, the pitfalls around this, other than just the social, anathema of what that means, and how these kinds of hate groups proliferate in the darkness, so to speak. But digging more into your work, and in your book, Algorithms of Oppression, You talk about the power of technology and the platforms that essentially influence every facet of our lives, personal, professional, and social, obviously. Can you talk a little bit more about that power and what we don't necessarily know is happening in the digital world today?
Sure. Okay, so it's probably helpful to just like share a quick bit about the first study that I did that led to that book, Algorithms of Oppression, because what I was thinking about as I was, working on the dissertation was how so many people were talking about Google, kind of like it was uh, a public library or it was, magical. I mean, they just, were enamored. And certainly Google is great for a lot of things. But I was surprised at knowing kind of that it was an advertising platform, not a knowledge portal. That if the public relates to something like that as a knowledge portal that's kind of neutral, that is curated, where there are people who are really smart who are helping you figure out what are the top 20 things you should see out of 30 million or 300 million potential websites, that there must be some really powerful logic in how we get to those top results, because the majority of people don't go past the first page of search
Right.
results when they use search engines. And it's also kind of banal. It's just like so basic and boring. I mean, no one really thinks about search engines like in a critical way. And I love the kinds of things that are like boring and banal, because I always feel like it's something's hiding in plain sight, it's like that. So it was true. Something was hiding in plain sight, this idea that search engines are advertising portals that can be powerfully gamed by people with a lot of money or a lot of technical skill. And how I revealed that and started, pulling at that thread was I started systematically searching different identities. So I took the census, I took every racial and ethnic category, I took the gender categories, and I looked to see how were those groups represented. So I looked at, white men, women, girls, boys, Black men, women, girls, boys, Latina, so forth, so forth, so forth. And what I found over and over again is that girls of color, in particular, of that data set, were almost always represented or misrepresented with pornography or kind of hypersexualized content. And I thought that this is kind of the nugget that people need to understand. It's like the most vulnerable group of people in our society, children of color who are girls, are overrepresented by pornography. And they're the least likely to have money to try to manipulate search engine rankings, and they're least likely to have the technical skill to do battle with, let's say, the porn industry. So that kind of was like the jumping off point. And then what I did is I just collected over years, over about 6 years, so much evidence of the way in which these kind of racist and sexist stereotypes get attached to people of color, to women of color. One of the more famous tweets that I, documented in the book was a tweet by a woman who Googled in Google image search professional hairstyles for work. And she contrasted that with unprofessional hairstyles for work. And of course, when she searched for unprofessional, it was almost exclusively Black women with natural hair. Those were the photos that came up. I have my hair slicked back today, but normally my hair is like this and it's big and natural. And then professional hairstyles for women was almost exclusively white women who were blonde with updos. So there was like over and over and over these kinds of like gross stereotypes that were really not even thought about twice. And so once you kind of put all of that evidence together in one book, you start to see like, oh, there's just like profound racist and sexist bias in search results. You don't notice it when you're just looking for one discrete thing. And many times because you're looking for banal things like, how close is the nearest Starbucks? It reinforces for you that it's trustworthy, because when you look for things that are kind of not consequential, it's accurate. And
Right.
then your trust is really transferred to believing other kinds of things that you find that are really discriminatory, because Google's been right on 70% of the things that didn't matter. But on the things that do matter about people and society, politics, power, science, these distortions then become extremely meaningful.
Gosh, yeah, that is frightening, and you're absolutely correct. Just the other day, I was doing a Google search, and funnily enough, I have a niece that's, quite um, versed on these kinds of biases, and particularly against women, and she's actually very, very vocal about that. And so it reminded me of a conversation I had with her because, I was just searching locally, and we're in a predominantly African American area. And, I literally could not find the name of the individual I was looking for. And it kept pulling me back to Virginia for some reason, and I didn't know if that just happened to be what was going on in our community at the time. It was just before the Virginia elections. But, it's disturbing. And as a woman entrepreneur and CEO, obviously when I started my company, the whole impetus actually for starting the company is I had reached the ceiling within my organization, which was not the top ceiling or even the second or the third to the top ceiling. But at the time, this is, late 1990s, that was, the max that we figured would be made available to women of color. And that is what drove me to start my organization. However, I did make sure in that to become aware that the individuals that we hired, I let them know right off the bat what my philosophy was, and I never shy away from it. But when it came back to the internet and using the internet for work, it's still an uncomfortable area for me personally, just because I naturally, push away from it. So I certainly appreciate scholars like yourself doing this research and the work, to educate us, because there's so much that goes on that we're just not aware of because we're not deep in it or studying it and working in it, like you are. And it's just such a huge subject, both in our, personal and professional lives.
Yeah.
So then it begs the question, how do we navigate the biases that are throughout the major search engines that we all use? And how do we ensure that when we do use those search engines, that we're getting the right information for what we're looking for it for?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I'm not sure I have, all the answers, but I will share a few that I think are helpful to kind of know. And I think there's kind of, let's say, a couple of different registers within which we can think about this. So the first is, in the case of your experience of like, why am I going back to Virginia? I mean, I think that part of what happens is that things that are important kind of, or that are getting a lot of attention, can skew what we find. So, for example, when I was doing those searches for years on Black girls and I was getting all the pornography, the criticism that was levied against the company for those kinds of results, and this was true for Asian girls, Latina girls, Black girls, all kind of sexualized, and of course those sites were they were women, they were not children, right? So they were, that's a thing that we should be clear of, like that women just get coded as girls. That's like a gender studies 101 kind of
Right.
problem. All right, so set that aside. What happens is if there is, let's say, a campaign or an effort underway that's also being highly optimized in other places, that will also start to rise and affect what we find in the rankings. So that is really partially what probably you were experiencing, is that a lot of people were trying to track and figure out what's going on in Virginia, and that was influencing the kinds of things you were finding, because that was an important kind of national, a lot of national attention on that race. All right, so then you have, what happens to yourself when you're in these spaces? Like what happens when you're looking for yourself? And I think this is probably really important because people are often now not even willing to meet people until they Google them, right? I mean, think about employers. They're even at UCLA, we're told, do not go on the internet and try to look up people. Like, you should only evaluate people from the materials submitted. Do you think that happens? I'm pretty sure no one follows those rules entirely. I mean, you just like, the temptation is too great and the socialization is too strong to access people in these ways without their knowing. People are social media stalking you and all these things. And the consequences of that are that, first of all, we have a whole generation of people who now have experienced these platforms speaking for them or representing them in ways that maybe they did not intend to be represented, or they misrepresent them. And so you see this like the I think it was a Palestinian student who was coming back from break last year over the holidays, and the border security wouldn't let them cross, Homeland Security wouldn't let them cross back into the United States because they had looked at their social media and their friends on Facebook had been critical of Israel. And so they were turned back, even though the student themselves had not really had said anything critical. Just by virtue of the network that they were in, they were evaluated in a particular way, and it had very serious consequences, like you can't go back to school. So that was, that was like a national story. There's the stories we hear, and these are just the ones that break through the media, but these are happening every day. People are being cyber stalked, or maybe non-consensual pornography is being posted around them, or nefarious or false or hateful or untrue things are posted on the internet about you or about people you're associated with, and you get connected digitally to these stories or to these conditions, and those things affect you. You might also just be the victim of the kinds of discrimination that you talked about happened with your name. I think of my friend and mentor, Dr. LaTanya Sweeney at Harvard, who's a computer science professor, who did a very famous study that really launched from her story of when I think she was at MIT as a professor, and she was interviewing at Harvard. And the dean that she was meeting with, who would have been her new boss, Googled her. And her name was LaTanya Sweeney. And he said, when she sat down, he said, "Do you want to tell me about your criminal past?" And she was stunned. She was like, "What are you saying? What are you talking about?" And he said, "She's a Black woman." And he said, "I Googled your name, and all these like criminal, like background check sites came up." And so she did a study where she searched on over 1,000 Black sounding names and contrasted that with 1,000 white sounding names. And what she found is that over and over again, Black sounding names were associated with criminal background checks and mugshot databases and these kinds of racial profiling systems. And white sounding names were never. So though there are many different ways in which, again, we get misrepresented or distorted by proximity or personally. And the thing that I think bothers me the most, and why I talk about and do this work, is because I know so many employers, colleges, universities, judges, lawyers, people in authority are using these technologies to try to cultivate a profile or a sense of who people are. And most people are not protecting themselves. Most people are having fun on the internet, or they're doing things that they don't think an employer will see, that they don't think an admissions counselor will see, that they don't think will affect them. But the truth is, so many of our online activities are really going into making a digital profile about us.
Yeah.
And it's a profile, or it's many hundreds or thousands of profiles that we will never fully understand algorithmically how they're encoded and what they mean. But we see them, how they show up in things like our credit scores. We see them in how they show up in other kinds of prediction scores, recidivism prediction scores that are used in courts, where you find yourself in front of a judge, and a judge is deciding based on, let's see, your zip code, your neighborhood, your family members, all kinds, your education, all kinds of things, whether or not you're a risk to society and whether you're going to be kept in jail or set free. And we found over and over again, as we study these scholars who look at this, that there's incredible racist and sexist bias built into these technologies and into these systems. And yet most people are both a product in them or engaging in using them like they're neutral, fair, and credible. And that's why we have to do this work. And this is why it's so important that we talk about it and try to pull back. I think if I were in one of these, I told you my origin story, right? As a young person, I'm pretty sure I would never have gotten a job. Who would ever let me be a professor, right? Who would let anybody really from Generation X do anything? For all the kinds of ways in which we were alienated and living as young people. And imagine if that was like captured into a digital profile and used algorithmically to determine whether we could have a future, whether we could be in certain kinds of jobs. You and I, in our own experiences, I'm sure, with racism and sexism on the job, and leaving jobs where we have been harmed in so many ways, and that being interpreted as our lack of reliability, let's say, rather than understanding the damage that we have faced in our employment situations. So those things are important, and that's why we, I think, can't just surrender all these decisions to the machines.
Oh, absolutely. And it is absolutely frightening because it affects and touches every facet of our lives. You mentioned, just simple things. For example, your credit scores and, getting mortgages and things like that. And it still shocks me, how mortgage companies use those algorithms. And I began to notice them, I would say, over the last 4 years, and I call it out when I see it. Because, and even in business, trying to get business lines of credit and, what that means. And many times I will force the bankers to explain exactly why they're requesting this thing or that thing. And where is it in the normal course of their business practice, regardless of zip code, regardless of business type or industry, that they request these things. But the double standard exists. And I believe that the advent of digital and the internet itself helps them mask some of that. But I think the more awareness that we're able to bring to just the general public to maintain a vigilance, if you will, on these things and call it out. It doesn't mean that you won't oblige and give correct information that everyone gets asked to provide. But it is alarming when, not just on the personal side, as I said, but in business is where I'll really, really push back and, hold their feet to the fire. And in many cases, move my business. If I think they are being unfairly, or I'm being targeted unfairly because of the zip code or where I live, on the East Coast or in Maryland, where we are, I'm in a predominantly African-American community and loved living here. However, 10 miles up the road is a predominantly white county. And, the issue is if I went there to get a mortgage, it would be a lot more difficult than here, even though the income levels are equitable and so on. But, that kind of unfairness is really what drives my passion personally and organizationally. And then, speaking of the work that we're doing for the Department of Labor in workforce development, we focus on nurturing and developing opportunities for underrepresented and marginalized groups for opportunities in employment and particularly in registered apprenticeship programs. So given your work and your experiences, where would you suggest that as an organization supporting the DOL with this important work, that we should focus our attention on creating opportunities in the digital world for minorities and women in particular?
It's such a great question. I will say that, the federal government has really been, in many ways, well, there's lots of different kinds of people who are thinking about technology and our kind of national technology and kind of digital infrastructure, our infrastructure for the use of AI. And I should say, we want to demystify artificial intelligence, because so many people think of artificial intelligence in these kind of anthropomorphized, like humanistic ways, like her, or Terminator, or robots, or like these kinds of, or like or Siri, Alexa, these ways in which a lot of people engage with AI. But AI is really just it's mathematical formulations, it's recipes you give to a computer, it's like a set of computational instructions. There's no intelligence to it. In fact, my colleague Meredith Broussard wrote a great book called Artificial Unintelligence, to really help us understand how not intelligent this kind of narrow AI is that we use. We don't have this general AI that's like going to take over humans yet. And we're a long way from that. But these narrow AI, these kind of more task-oriented types of use of AI, are really, really important to pay attention to. Now, we have some people who I think will argue that we're in an AI arms race with China and other countries, and that our entire system needs to be automated and as quickly as possible. But one of the things we want to remember is that we live in an extremely heterogeneous society in the United States, where to try to classify this kind of hyper surgical level the public is really dangerous. We have a history, we have these kind of profound histories and kind of contemporary experiences, still legacies that are with us, of enslavement, of occupation, of denial of civil and human rights to women, to people of color, to disabled people. And the data that is derived to kind of train machine learning algorithms and AI in all of these different systems that are at the kind of federal, state, and municipal level, the data is filled with these histories of discrimination. And one of the things that's so important that we understand is that data scientists who are, let's say, making algorithms to find great employees, they're not looking at the history of racial discrimination, and that just, in our own lives, we're still discriminated against, right? But certainly our parents were. I mean, my parents grew up under segregation, before 1964, the passage of the Civil Rights Act. They were born long before that. And so if we're looking for data about who's a model employee, who will be great fit for these different kinds of jobs, we're using historical data. But the data is fraught with that there were very narrow segments of the public who could be employed in different kinds of jobs. And there's not a lot of questioning around that data. Where does that data come from? How old is it? What does it represent? How are we mitigating and dealing with racial and gender and ability discrimination? Most data scientists and computer scientists, people who are working with that data, will never ask those kinds of questions, these like sociological kinds of questions, historical questions. They will just flatten the data and they will look for patterns of success. Well, what will happen? Well, when you look for patterns of success, you will get the people who have, for the longest term, had the most access. And so, like my friend Kathy O'Neill, who wrote this great book called Weapons of Math Destruction, says, what the AI will do is it will help people who've already been successful and who are already at the top and who are already doing great be greater. And people who've been discriminated against and been harmed be worse off. And those are the kinds of things that worry me the most when we start talking about applying these kinds of systems to employment, which has to be one of the places. I mean, that has been a huge site of struggle for civil rights and, access. And we see this play out. I mean, just a couple of years ago, the Apple credit card, you might remember, was introduced. And I was thinking of you. I keep thinking of you and your story about getting the mortgages. And right as soon as it was introduced, several great men of Silicon Valley, we'll call them, okay, several white male founders of big tech companies started tweeting out their outrage that they had been given 20 times the credit than their wives, Even though they were married, they filed their taxes jointly. The wives had better credit scores than the men. And the men were all given like 20 times the credit limit on their new Apple cards. One of them was a co-founder of Apple. And they were so incensed. They called up, to the bank, and they're talking to customer service, and they're like, explain to me how this happened. And of course, what does the poor customer service rep do? They're like, the algorithm just said, and these are like guys who write algorithms for a living. And they're like, the algorithm said, what are you talking about? And they, of course, they couldn't be explained, couldn't be understood. This was a huge news story. And when I talked to NPR about this, they said, Dr. Noble, why did this happen? And I said, well, listen, this is so obvious to me. My own mother could not get a bank account without her father or her husband signing. You might remember this. Okay. Yeah. And so if women have only had their own independent credit since the 80s, what do you think was going to happen? They used historical banking data. They used historical credit data. Men have had it the whole time since the invention of these systems. And women just barely got it, and people of color just barely got it. So of course we have lower everything. Those are the kinds of questions. Those are the kinds of outcomes. The answer that the algorithm pointed us to the best employees or the most creditworthy people or the people who should get into school or get a mortgage or get housing, the algorithm decided is a horrible answer. It's unacceptable. And we need to have people who are in leadership like you, who are pressing on the leadership of organizations in this country to really nuance these conversations and actually refuse the use of these technologies until there is proof that they do not discriminate.
Absolutely. And, there's so much, so many directions I could go with that, just, personally and professionally. But, when I started the company, so I created my own access, right, to business by starting the company, and removed myself from corporate America because I didn't even want to compete in that unfair system. But still, it's a struggle, right? So I've been in business 21 years, and the equity is what's we're still dealing with and struggling with. And just as in the AI, there's no way to get equity in that artificial intelligence or those search engines until either time has passed, where, as you described, that historical knowledge or historical credit ratings, let's say, of marginalized communities, women and African Americans included, has that same length of time and built up credit worthiness, if you will, for lack of a better term, but just history.
Yeah.
That those algorithms can base their searches on, or
that's right.
Yeah, and so it's very frustrating, to say the least. But as a business owner, and all business owners that I come in contact with, I press and I say to them, you've got to hold these other kinds of organizations accountable, and we've got to be very careful that we don't buy into those systems because we're told, oh, they make you more efficient, they make your organization more efficient. Not necessarily. It's for me, it's about the people first, and understanding where they come from. Yeah. And that speaks so much to, what we are doing in the workforce development space, because a lot of the underrepresented groups that we focus and target, they're just beginning to even believe potentially that there are genuine opportunities for them to earn a livable wage. So not only are we fighting those hurdles, but we're fighting the hurdles of which are providing access to those individuals, but we're also fighting the hurdles of how do we bring them an equitable seat at the table, whether it's the proverbial educational table, employment table, social table, whatever that may be. And I don't think that it will be solved, certainly in my lifetime, perhaps, my children's lifetime, we can hope. But, it's just a fascinating topic. And, so glad that people like yourself are in this for the long run. But I know, so as we're wrapping up the conversation, I want to make sure that we bring up your latest article out of The Cut.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, well,
All
I
right.
think everyone can potentially relate to this, right? So you talk in the article about the biased criticisms of Meghan Markle that everyone knows, and about how digital media and some of our favorite platforms are weaponized against Black women, which you've touched on already this morning.
Yes.
And back to your original research. Can you provide any insight to our audiences regarding how we should take care of our social media profiles, personally and professionally, to avoid some of those mischaracterizations and discrimination, racism, or sexism that can be detrimental to all of us?
Sure. So let me just say in kind of full disclosure that, I met Meghan Markle, I don't know, over a year ago because she had read my book. Someone that I knew gave her my book. And I found out off the internet that she had read my book because she was telling Gloria Steinem about this book and that she read and that she loved. And and of course, I ran around my house freaking out because when does like somebody famous share your book when you're a scholar? That's like never, that's unheard of. Okay, so uh, I I met her, and one of the things she said is that her experience had really been, she'd been driven off the internet. She's in 2019, she was the most trolled person in the world, by most standards. And I've watched her life, and of course, she and her husband have supported our center and our research at UCLA because they are so harmed themselves in these different ways by trolls, and their lives threatened constantly. And so I wrote this piece because, Meghan Markle was able to go to court and really try to fight and win against the British tabloids. But most of us, you and I, will never have the resources to go and fight the kinds of machines and the manufacture of hate, and trolling or propaganda or disinformation that might get attached to us at some point or to our work. And everyday people are certainly in no position to be able to defend themselves, and especially Black women, because taking down Black women is, one of America's favorite pastimes in terms of taking us down for sport, discriminating against us, making us do 300 times the work of our white counterparts in order to just have a seat at the table. I mean, you and I we could be in tears, I'm sure, within 15 minutes telling our own stories. So we know that this is happening. And I think it's so crucial that when we see a very public figure who is targeted and bullied online, that we understand there will be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who we will never know their names, who will be driven off the internet, who will be harmed, who will be stalked, who will be damaged by social media and by these kinds of internet connections that we make. And so it's really important, I think, that we think about what are the legislative guardrails? How do we have civil rights that extend also to our experiences on the internet? How do we protect human rights? How do we not have these experiences over determine what a person's future can be like? And one of the things I say in that article is that the kind of harassment that Black women and women of color experience on the internet, the reason why we must pay attention to it is because for many of us, it forces our withdrawal from participation in all kinds of things at a time when, I'll say it here, this country needs Black women and women of color in the forefront. If we study social movements, we see that the abolitionist movement to end the enslavement of African peoples, the movements to end occupation around the world, the moves and the organizing for the expansion of voting rights, of civil rights, of LGBTQIA plus rights have been led by people of color, especially women of color, non-binary people. And so we don't want these folks retreating. We want them in the front, helping us think about the most inclusive, democratic, participatory kinds of societies that we can have that are economically, socially, and politically fair, because these are people who feel the brunt of the unfairness. And so this is kind of the call in the cut. And I'm grateful, that you invoked it, because I look around constantly and I see a hoarding and an immoral, unethical control over resources to the detriment of the majority of the planet. I mean, one of the biggest claims that I make in the book is I say we have more data and technology than ever. And we
Right.
have more social, political, and economic injustice and inequality to go with it. These technologies were supposed to liberate us. That was their alleged promise. But of course, what they've done is concentrate wealth in the hands of a few, make it more efficient to discriminate, make it more efficient to sequester resources and opportunity away and into the hands, and then just call it science, then just call it math. I mean, nothing could be more important to me as the kind of 21st civil and human rights issue of the day. And so I get up every day and I work on this.
Well, I'm glad you do, because honestly, it's overwhelming to us that are not living and breathing it every day professionally. Obviously, personally, some of us dabble in it more than others, but the Meghan Markle situation did bring it home, because it made the average woman pause and think, if they could do that to her, what would they do to just little old me, kind of thing, in the corner, posting about some recipe I didn't like, perhaps.
Yeah.
And it's very demoralizing. And the gut instinct is to, pull away from it. But I think more and more, as the younger generation certainly keep this in the forefront, because again, I was born in the 60s. And so, we weren't raised to have to put our ideas and thoughts right there in the open. It was just different. And so it's something that we're having to learn. Folks of my age are having to adapt to that, slowly. I don't know that we would ever adapt to it fully. But I'm glad that we've got this broad swath of individuals and age groups and populations that are really focusing on this issue, because if we don't get it right, I just hate to think, what would happen. But we've got to solve this problem. We've got to solve it for ourselves. We've got to solve it for our children, our children's children. Otherwise, all this technology will have been for naught.
Yeah, I think, in our research center at UCLA, one of the things we say among our team is small. It's this kind of a small team of mostly women and queer people. And, we say we want our work to be high touch and high quality. And we understand that, like, trying to automate our work, or trying to, we don't use certain kinds of research methods because we think that there's too much loss. There's too much abstraction, which is what happens when you use, like, a lot of big data methods. There's a lot of loss. The data, like, I'll give you an example. When the mortgage crisis hit, it started in 2006. It really kind of hit its apex in 2008. And the recession was kind of full blown. We had the largest wipeout of Black wealth in the history of the United States. All the gains of Reconstruction, all the gains of the New Deal, all the gains of the Civil Rights Movement vanished. We're talking about centuries of struggle to accumulate resources and wealth in Black families, Black neighborhoods, Black communities. The largest wipeout happened during the recession. It makes my stomach turn when I think about it. And what was happening was a broad, kind of massive gamification of the financial markets, using kind of big data techniques to look for and exploit and try to find patterns and people and communities where hedge funds could go in and kind of take these banks could take these houses. And so you think about something like that. Well, see, that's a method that actually did not account for the up close texture of the people, the individuals, the families who would be affected by those kinds of methods, those kinds of approaches. So that's a cautionary tale for us. It also might mean then, could we use those kinds of methods to redistribute resources, but see, that's not usually what happens. They're usually
Mhm.
used in these kind of more exploitive fashions to kind of cherry pick what's most optimal for people in power. And I think these are the kinds of questions we have to be asking. So, like, if you're using these different kinds of AI in your organization, you should be asking how they work, exactly what happens. You should be looking for patterns and trends. You should be trying to analyze the data to see what kind of profile is the model profile that this technology has been um, designed for. There's always a model. And, I'll give you this kind of last little nugget. When we were, we were looking at Amazon a few years ago. Amazon decided it was going to try a new AI in it for its HR systems because Amazon has thousands of people who apply for
Right.
jobs every day. All right, so Amazon deploys this new AI that they use as a software screener on all the resumes, and they program like what's the model employee for Amazon, and you know what happened? Not one woman made it through their screening process of their software.
Wow.
So what does that tell you? That tells, I mean, of course, they immediately scrapped it. They knew it was wrong. But here's what's happening in HR and hiring. We have these software systems that are screening thousands. So maybe we want to say, listen, what's a different high touch approach we could take where we're looking for not everybody to be the same inside the model. Maybe we're actually looking for a tremendous amount of diversity because that we know the data shows us very, very diverse teams get us the best products, get us the
Right.
best services, get us the best everything. So we're not looking to model to screen for the same. We're looking for a model that distributes and helps us find novelty and interesting people. And this is where we'll do better because we're
Yes.
interesting and we're novel, right? And we have different kinds of work experiences and we don't go to all the same fancy schools and places, right? We go where we go and we do what we do. And that to me is really, the kinds of questions that we need you asking these organizations and really kind of pressing. And I think, employees, future employees, we should advocate for ourselves. We should say, we should find ways to um, work with organizations like yours to get a foot in the door and then, be seen and be
Right.
seen for more than just like the data or the text on the resume, but be seen like for who we are. And then we need to bring who we are to these jobs too.
Oh, absolutely. So well said. This has really, really been an amazing conversation and, incredible information that you've shared with us today. I think all of us can relate to all, if not most, of the information that you've shared. And, I think one takeaway I want to make sure that I retain is, as I continue in my quest as an entrepreneur and CEO, to just really keep that in the forefront and make sure that as much as I can educate the folks on my team to make sure that we're also, they're also understanding, what I'm focused on and how critical it is. Even more so now, I feel like we're at this crossroads that we're going to either make a difference or not in where we go from this point. But I think so. So I want to thank you, of course, for your time this morning. I think we may have some time for some questions from the audience, perhaps. Let me just have a look here. Oh, yeah, we do. Let me just click here. So one of the questions from the audience is, have you come across any search engines that are less biased than Google?
Well, I really try not to endorse any products or services. I will say that, we watch companies like DuckDuckGo. I use that personally on my phone because it doesn't track me, to the same degree that Google does. And I think it's important for you to know how you're tracked on the internet so that as you're using certain platforms, you leave digital traces that you take into the next platform. This is why you're
Right.
always trying to figure out, why does Facebook know everything? Why does Instagram know
Yeah.
everything that I want? Because it's been watching everything that you do. So, in fact, the Markup, which is a great journalism outfit, the Markup, they do investigative journalism around the tech sector. They have a new tool that's called Backlight. Is it Blacklight or Backlight? And it, you can find it. And it will tell you where you're leaving all your traces. So that's a good thing that you should just install and watch and learn from. It will tell you about kind of like things that you thought were private that are not private that you're looking for.
Right.
So DuckDuckGo is, I would say, gives you, more privacy, but, any search engine that is going to give you a ranking interface is already kind of, got to be a challenge, because
Yeah.
the terms upon which that ranking happens and the kind of context of ranking is a challenge. It's a problem.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you for that. Let's see, another question. What can employers implement now to ensure they are not unknowingly being biased in their employment practices?
Well, I think for sure employers should be suspicious about software screening technologies and HR screening technologies. There are a lot of scholars working on that right now. You can read scholarly papers about software screening. I've heard some stories on NPR and people interviewed where these are just tremendously racially biased technologies and gender biased. And I think, and class, in fact, biased.
Yeah.
They're biased toward affluent people. So I think you want to figure out how to partner. If you can't hire more people inside who do HR, then partner with organizations like yours, Claire, who can help people and your partners, right? Intern networks of organizations that can help you screen and meet and vet and connect with employees. I think the high touch, high quality approach is really, really important, because I've run a business and I will tell you that turnover is very expensive.
Yeah.
Hiring is very expensive. Training is very expensive. Why would you turn over that much resource to software when you could go through trusted networks that can help you better get to know future employees so that you really get good matches? And I believe in workforce development and workforce training and workforce training organizations, because I believe that people who work in them, my friend Akil and others who are so brilliant in this work, they get to know the people that they're working with. They really are good matchmakers. Those are high skilled people that are very well trained in that kind of matchmaking, and it's worth investing in those kinds of people and organizations rather than turning it over to an algorithm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely agree with that, because again, in our communities as well, you need more of that personal touch, because there's a lack of trust, in many communities about, how open a position actually is, or how real a job is, or course or school program. So, we do believe in that personal touch for sure. But I love your phrase, the high touch, high quality, definitely, is the way to go. So I think we have time for one last question. Let's see here. What are your thoughts on microaggression at varied levels in the workplace?
Well, I think microaggressions and macroaggressions and aggressions of all types are very real. I think we're living in a moment where racism has, or let's say unchecked racism, has come back into fashion in the way it was in let's say, the 1940s or 50s or even the 60s. I think there are also people who are incredibly thoughtful and sensitive and aware, and so. What I try to do with my students, I'll say, is I say, try to find your own calibration methods for the kinds of aggressions that are debilitating and the kind that are annoying, and do the self-compassion work to protect yourself from these kinds of experiences. I have them all the time in my job too, believe it or not, as a UCLA professor. Um, I try to sort out for myself what's a 2 and what's a 10, so that
Right.
there's room to go, so that all the 2s are not 10s, because I don't want to die of high blood pressure or diabetes or stress or stroke or any of those things. And I don't want to give my life force over to the people who do that in order to kind of, enact harm. So I think have friends, laugh, pick it apart, talk trash on it, do all the things that you need to do, have allies, have a person in your workplace that you can trust, that you can confide in, that can confide in you and that trusts you and hold each other up. We will not be able to stop the things that we cannot control that come our way, but we can control our own spirit and our own response. And that's, you do not underestimate how powerful that is to not let people win. It's
Yeah.
like, I love it when people try to dunk on me and I'm like, I don't even care, yo. I don't even care. You try to dunk on me, who cares? Like, it means
Absolutely.
nothing to me. So, you have to get some of that in you too,
Right.
so that you can live in this world. All right.
Oh,
And my
definitely.
thoughts
I
for you.
think, oh, absolutely. It's definitely the David and Goliath story all the time. And you're right. That's certainly one of my coping mechanisms is, yeah, let it roll off my back, and keep on like, all right, let's go, for the next round kind of thing. Or let me help you, let me educate you on why whatever thing you just said, microaggression, if you will, is ridiculous.
Yeah.
But Dr. Noble, thank you so much. This
Yeah.
was absolutely a wonderful time with you this morning. And the information you shared, I know, we're recording it, so it will be shared with any of our members or teams that did not get a chance to listen live.
Wonderful.
But we certainly look forward to reading more about your work in the future. And so we'll keep in touch. But thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And thanks for everybody who did all the work behind the scenes to make this happen for us. I appreciate everyone so much.